If I were to describe the creators of this franchise in so many words, aside from off the wall insane, I would say incredibly passionate. Interestingly enough, though, according to an interview with head writer Akifumi Kaneko, he wasn't planning on making anything after GX, but thanks to some prodding from co-creator Noriyasu Agematsu, he started to realize he was having fun writing for this franchise and decided to keep going. Thus, it's actually kind of amazing how this season turned out with how much painstaking lore and continuity it managed to throw in. I can barely maintain continuity between my videos, and yet these guys are digging up some of the most minute of plot points and logically building off of them. This was helped by the fact that director Katsumi Ono also provided his own input, which I imagine included references to that other show he won't let us forget he made. But regardless, with everyone on board, it really does show how much care went into this show, which I will be eternally grateful for. With that, let's wrap up this little season review with the second half of Symphogear AXZ. Continuing where we left off, the search for the Full Stone was on. Okay, who forgot to house train the Kika? But yeah, she managed to find Hibiki's scab, and Elf 9 can get right to work on buffing their gears to resist the Philosopher's Stone. That said, a certain commander still thought his soldiers could always use a little more training. Yeah, they'd probably have to continue on a really stupid and overcomplicated fetch quest. Sure enough, while they could handle the VR noise with no issue, Genjiro proved to be a little bit more challenging. Pretty sure he gave up on the whole being human thing a long time ago. And yes, that was a JoJo reference, so let's just get that out of the way. During all of this, Cagliostro was fixing her teammate after the events of the last episode, where she also overheard Saint Germain and Adam's conversation at the end of that. This gave her the resolve to take matters into her own hands and deal with the gear users. And she would run into a couple of convenient targets as Tsubasa had convinced Chris to at least go see Stefan off before he left Japan. She launched an attack just as Chris was about to have a moment with the siblings. The rest of the gear users managed to join in on the fight, but Cagliostro already had a countermeasure for that in the form of some pocket dimension portals that would at least temporarily remove 2/3 of our heroines from the battle. She also wisely left only Chris and Maria, a pairing that has never really worked together and do have conflicting fighting styles, a gunner and a knife thrower. Moreover, Cagliostro herself turned out to be a CQC specialist that could close the fighting gap between both of them. With all that in mind, it seemed like she had already won, but Chris got a little encouragement from a kid with an awesome cyborg leg. Taking those words to heart, Maria and Chris managed to regroup, and while this was their first time really fighting together, they actually prepped for this thanks to Genjiro's training, where he had them try every team combination possible. Thus, they managed to push back against Cagliostro, who in a nice subtle bit of voice acting was lowering her tone as the fight went on, until... Shota, your inner shonen protagonist is showing. Though, even with a very Simon-esque voice plus a Hell in Heaven, Chris and Maria managed to defeat her with their own combination attack. And with that, the episode ended with Chris being able to send Sonia and Stefan off with a smile, putting a nice end to a slightly convoluted subplot. Episode 9 opened with Elf 9, unfortunately being forced to apologize, as the Full Stone's effects came with some cooldown time, so Chris and Maria were temporarily benched. Thus, they had to focus on their remaining members and team combos. This would be particularly tricky for Shabe, who usually only worked with her most obvious partners, though at least Ogawa helped train them. Well, you are faring a little better than in the kind of sort of Higurashi remake. Ultimately, Shiabe's training failed, with her being unable to increase her phonic game with anyone aside from Kiika, but she did catch the attention of Tsubasa, who could relate with her plight. Later, following a lead from Yatsuhiro, the gear users were tasked with scoping out a shrine on the ley lines. There, a rather eccentric priest was able to tell them about a possible gateway formed by the shrines in the area that formed the Orion constellation. Oh damn, is the Grand Archer getting involved? Somebody better make sure Artemis doesn't learn about this. During all of this, we learned a little bit more about Kiika and Shiabe's backstory that would play into this episode and the next. Back with the Illuminati, Pralati poured a couple for herself and Cagliostro. Not sure if I would ever put milk in a wine glass, but more importantly, we learned a couple of important details about her ally. First of all, she had indeed shared what she had heard about Adam's plan with Pralati, and second... Yep, Cagliostro was a post-op trans woman. That's honestly pretty cool for a Japanese anime, and it was woven into this show's narrative fairly naturally. It's also pretty appropriate that Shota is going to play Fisheye in the upcoming Sailor Moon Eternal movie. Back with Shiabe, the priest managed to share some very strong words of wisdom about how people can't live life entirely on their own, and just in general having some great interactions with the rabbit-themed gear user. I especially love this little bit where, in spite of claiming that she wasn't good with customs and rules, Shiabe still pretty much nailed imitating the priest's bowing gestures, suggesting that she actually does want to be a part of the group. Yeah, they still ended up spelling it out afterwards, but still good visual storytelling. Oh man, also the moon in the show had become a mini Saturn. Not gonna lie, I kind of wish our moon would turn into that. We then cut back over to the Illuminati, where Tiki ended up sharing her dreams of the future. Only Hinakino could get away with saying something like that in her stereotypically cutesy anime voice. As a result, she also ended up confirming Cagliostro's claims about Adame's, quite frankly, pretty standard evil villain plans. She ran off to warn Saint Germain about this, using her kendama as a vehicle while also surprisingly staying in her lane. Yeah, obviously this would be hard for Song to not notice, resulting in the two vehicular gear users to give chase. Weirdest version of Mario Kart ever, and yet they still won't bring back the double dash mechanic. Actually, the more I look at them, these roads kind of look like they're meant to go to satellite. Damn it, Ono. Still, rather than a card game, we did get some decent interaction between the two gear users. Yeah, an obvious pattern they're going for in the latter half of the season was having our heroines split up into new pairings so that they could explore some new means of character development. The last episode didn't exactly feature this, as Maria had pretty much completed her arc for this season, while Chris was in the process of wrapping up hers, though we did at least get a cool finisher out of the two. Here, we're getting an interaction between the two most socially awkward heroines, who had created emotional walls to everyone except the ones they were the closest to. However, Tsubasa was, for the most part, able to break down her walls, and now watch break down some with Shiabe, both figuratively and kind of literally in this case. It's honestly nothing spectacular, since these are basically just one-off interactions, but it's also not a bad way of incorporating as much as they can into this one season. With that, they engage their Ignite modules and start to cause all sorts of property damage. Man, I feel bad for the commuters tomorrow morning. And of course, for a scene like this, it could only end with some big vehicular collisions. We get it, Ono. You really like the designs of some of the D-wheels, no matter how impractical they were. Move on already. They defeated Pralati, and we ended the episode with Saint Germain regretting the fact that her indecision had left her with both no sacrifices or allies left. With that, episode 10 opened with her counting up the latest two casualties of her little crusade. Pot, kettle, pot. I'm sure you two are gonna get along just fine. Cutting away to less serious stuff, we contrasted Saint Germain's broken philosophy with Hibiki's flawed yet infinitely more solid beliefs. For a show like this, it's a surprisingly subtle yet strong bit of characterization between our main protagonist and antagonist. Boy, I've been saying stuff like that for a lot of the season, haven't I? And as some icing on the cake, we got a good Chris Tsundere moment, so yeah, absolute perfection. Later, the Gear users recon to discuss their countermeasures against the Illuminati opening the gate to their so-called god. Thus, they would need some sort of weapon that could perform deicide, and yeah, it's going to be the most obvious solution. Why even question it at this point? On that note though, with her birthday coming up, Kika suggested they throw a party in a couple of days in spite of the fact they were in the middle of an intense battle with an apocalypse cult. Needless to say, she was being more than a little short-sighted. When this was pointed out to her, it hit Kika pretty hard as she recollected a grave error she made that resulted in the deaths of several men by Cagliostro. I gotta say, of all the odd pairings they're doing for this final stretch of this season, I think Kika and Hibiki is my personal favorite, as they do bring up a certain subject that I brought up a lot recently myself, the importance of accountability and responsibility, which just kind of seems to be a thing with Aoyuki characters. Right now, we have two extremes of Saint Germain and Hibiki. The former promotes the belief that sacrifices are necessary for the greater good, while the latter believes in the minimal conflict scenario. Kika here kind of acts as the in-between in that her short-sightedness doesn't allow her to fully grasp either side of the conflict. That'll turn out to be her greatest strength and weakness, as we'll soon see. With that, the Illuminati began their ritual with Saint Germain acting as a catalyst to open the gate. However, things weren't going as expected, as shown by her extreme case of shafting. Okay, I'll admit, if whatever made an evil smirk like that, I would take back all of my criticisms of her. Anyway, the gate opened and the auto score began to play her role, and geez, I'm giving the Hayate sensors a lot to work with today. Fortunately, Genjo and Yatsuhiro had a countermeasure put in place. Should I even bother pointing out what they're referencing? And yet, this isn't even going to be the last reference they're going to do this season. Also, I guess Kaneko liked this scene so much they started to play some very Wild Arms-esque music. With the villain successfully cut off, Hibiki and Kika engaged Saint Germain. And again, while I'm not a huge fan of her design, I'll give credit to these pigtail Vulcan guns. However, that somewhat impractical headwear wasn't enough to stop these two and their total disregard for private property. Moreover, Hibiki managed to get a win over her morally, as Saint Germain revealed some of her underlying and selfish desires for her little revolution. After all, what's the point in defying God if you have to use God's own powers? Of course, those words didn't apply to this dude, who decided now to reveal his true colors.
Well, duh.
Through a lot of technobabble, he managed to open the gate and use Tiki as a vessel for the god's essence. He then had her launch an attack to destroy her protagonist, but a swan song by Kika held it off. Through this, she acknowledged her naivete and recklessness, as even now she was pushing herself to the absolute limit, but for one Gear user, she wanted to preserve the life of a friend who at least knew her own birthday, unlike her. I love this season. With that, it was down to Hibiki and Saint Germain against a godlike force. The odds seemed against them, but... pretty sure that's just a catchphrase for every Aoyuki character. Thanks to one of my commenters for pointing this out, by the way. Going to episode 11, the two enemies worked together, confusing Chris, to which Tsubasa correctly pointed out the fallacy in that. And also really, how many face turns have we seen in these anime seasons and not even getting into XD? Anyway, their target was the vessel Tiki.
Phrasing?
Saint Germain realized Adam had used almost all of his powers to just open the gate, making him an easy obstacle to overcome. In the process, they managed to reveal that he was an android. Okay, so let me bring up one thing that I really should have in the last part, but I'm a bit of an idiot who doesn't do his research. Adam Weishaupt was in fact a real person, and the supposed founder of the real-life Illuminati. In the world of Symphogear, I guess they decided to turn him into a supposedly perfect creation by some alchemist who realized they had probably created an egomaniacal monster. Yeah, they tried to give this dude some sort of motivations, but it's not gonna save him from being one of the least interesting big bads of this franchise. In any case, this ended up setting off Tiki, who entered into her final form, the Mother of Ultras, and yes, this was a real thing. Oh great, now you've doomed poor Sandra Bullock to endlessly drift into the void. Actually, this would lead into an international incident with the US that this old geezer would only make worse, as we soon see. In any case, the battle wasn't going well, as the Ultra Mother had that overpowered regeneration ability. However, they received some hope from an anonymous call from someone who managed to translate some of the ancient documents that revealed the ultimate weapon of deicide, which, again, take a guess what it was.
What a surprise!
So, yeah, literally, they didn't have to do anything different, just maybe have Hibiki punch a little harder. I think I could safely say this was one of the outright dumber moments of the series, but I won't say it was bad, if only because the caller revealed that the documents they translated were on that one plane Kiyika and Shiabe rescued, showing that while their actions were reckless, they weren't in vain. Moreover, it was highly implied he was one of the astronauts on that shuttle Hibiki suplexed in the first episode of GX. So it was both kind of heartwarming and had some great continuity that kind of made up for that big duh moment. With that, Hibiki started to beat down on Tiki while Saint Germain dealt with Adam.
Using your own mechanical arm as a weapon? Yeah, no, that's still dumb.
Regardless, with the opening from AXZ backing her and a good old Giga drill break, Hibiki managed to tear apart the living Barbie doll. However, the essence of the god was still present, and it wanted to find a new vessel. Adam, of course, tried to take it, but I think it knew who was the most OP character in this whole damn show.
Damn it, Nodoka, will you stop catching the Byogans already?
Going into the penultimate episode of the series, Hibiki had been encased in a giant cocoon. This led to all sorts of international concerns, especially with the US after the whole satellite and killing George Clooney thing. As a result, they were ready to launch the nukes. With the clock ticking down, the gear users had to act fast alongside their enemy mine. And for the most part, they had a solid plan in place. But remember Tsubasa's NTR grandpa daddy? Well, he deemed Hibiki as a national threat to be taken care of by the Japanese military.
Or, you know, you might end up accelerating the process if you acknowledge her as a potential international threat, you senile old geezer.
To her credit, Saint Germain correctly pointed out what exactly this guy was. The cocoon eventually hatched into Hibiki's version of the Ultra Mother, either that or Tiamat. However, even without some buffs from Merlin, they had some anti-linker to weaken her.
Oh, come on, dude, you can't quit on me now!
But the thing that proved to be the most effective were, of course, the words of her waifu. Seriously, Miku, I'm starting to understand what was the deal with that frustrated grunt in the last part. You do way too much for this girl. With that, as indicated by the color timer, they managed to release Hibiki from Tsuburaya Productions. With that, the day was won and everything was cool, right? Well...
No comment.
I'll just say this, thanks a lot, you useless old fart. Wanting to make amends for her actions, Saint Germain went to deal with the Duke, and she wouldn't have to do it alone, as it turned out Cagliostro and Prelati were there. Yeah, apparently the former faked her own death and rescued the latter. Well, okay, but what took you guys so long? I get that they were making this new bullet for Saint Germain, but you couldn't have come out and helped with the fights against the Ultra Mothers? Well, whatever, their song was awesome, and they managed to blow up the nuke and contain the resulting explosion. Unfortunately, in order to do so, they had to transmute the remaining life forces.
May I say once again, screw this geriatric warmonger.
But okay, now the battle was over, right? Well... However, in a nice ironic twist, the very embodiment of his selfish desires ended up holding him back at the very last minute, and Hibiki said those two words again.
Well, can't argue with that.
But we still had one more episode, and even without the powers of a god, this dude proved to be a massive blowhard. They first took on some of his remaining alkanoids.
You say that while they're fighting a bunch of normal mooks and a dude with one arm. It's as if they know this is the final episode of the season and they have to keep up with tradition.
I mean, yeah, Adam turned out to have the powers of a proper final boss, but they didn't know that at the time. Speaking of which, he went into his final form and proceeded to whine about it.
I really miss Fina and Carol.
He managed to push the gear users back a little, but a quick reset of their base forms gave them some new powers that, as Chris put it, made the extras unnecessary. However, unlike her teammates, Hibiki's gear still hadn't had the after effects of the Full Stone removed from it, thus warranting her borrowing the powers of her teammates.
Now you see pretty clear this is how you do it.
The main character is in mortal danger, so the team gives her their powers as it's the only option.
If you're going to do it with Noaka, do it like this.
It also worked out thematically, as not only did she borrow the powers of her fellow gear users, but also of the former Illuminati, giving her a golden form. Yeah, there's that second Gal Gaiga reference. Hell, considering how many references we've done this season, why don't we top it off with just one more?
If you ever want to see an Aoyuki magical girl delivered aura, then you, my friend, have excellent taste.
With that, we began to wrap up the season with some far more blatant sequel bait than the previous. Again, Kaneko only threw in some last-minute bait for this season back in GX, so at least this time he was far more prepared. But more importantly than this dude being blatantly evil, was Hibiki being able to celebrate her slightly belated birthday party. Cute stuff, where we got to see a little bit of everyone's personality, closing out with some strong words from our main couple.
After
the credits though, we got the most obvious sequel bait as Elf9 realized the reason Hibiki became the preferred vessel for the god's essence was because she had been caught in the purifying light of Shenshongji back in season 2. And of course, she wasn't the only one to take a dip in the holy laser beam.
This was an excellent season. I mean, we got some mostly good villains, as well as plenty of development for all of our main characters, which is saying something considering how huge the cast was at this point. Yes, there were some blatantly dumb moments here and there, but they were quickly drowned out by the fun kind of dumb moments.
As I said, there was just so much clear passion put into this season, in spite of Akifumi Kaneko stating that he was originally planning on ending the series with GX. And I think we can all agree we're thankful he didn't. Just because these characters had mostly been developed to a satisfying degree doesn't mean there wasn't a little more space to expand, and I think they found ways to do it very effectively. Maria did kind of retread familiar ground, and of course they had to bring back that stupid meme. But it was also nice to see her past with Nastasia expanded upon a little more, and to see her finally fully solidify her resolve. She was definitely not the indecisive lady from the second season who followed this weirdo for whatever reason. Chris's arc this season was good, though not great. It was mostly sold on her just being a really well-developed character and providing some really great quotes, probably better than some of Hibiki's, as she recognized the moral gray area more than others in the magical girl genre. Her stuff with Stefan and Sonia was just okay, nowhere near as good as Kika and Shabe in the previous season. I mean, it's pretty clear that Sonia was retconned in later, as she never appeared in any of Chris's previous flashbacks. So they had to work with these one-off season characters, and in that sense, they did okay for what they were, but again, Chris is just a great character in general. Tsubasa didn't do much of anything this season. I mean, it's obvious they're building towards the Kazanaris playing a much bigger role next season, so it's understandable they would want to hold back here. For the most part though, she just reaffirmed her dedication to her late waifu, and did have a decent exchange with Shabe about protecting others through kindness that could be misconstrued as distancing herself from others. But yeah, the one who really got to development in that episode was Shabe. She seemed to suffer from the classic hedgehog's dilemma due to her having a very low opinion of herself, which has been kind of her thing since her first appearance. Perhaps the real reason she lashed out at Hibiki originally was because she had low confidence in their plan succeeding, as she might have ended up holding them back. A lot of her insecurities seem to stem from her not even really knowing her birth name. Truth be told though, she was very much capable as both a gear user and as a friend. She just needed to take a minute to recognize the kindness that she had always been providing to those around her. Her life partner, Kika, probably had her best showing this season. While she even admitted herself that she has always been a bit of a simple-minded goober lacking a lot of foresight, the fact that she did at least recognize this and did suffer significant consequences for it put her above others who will remain nameless. Much like Xiaobe, she had a low self-esteem stemming from a lack of identity, though probably more so than her, having spent a good chunk of the second season resolving herself to the idea that her very existence would just fade away when Fine would take over. Thus, while she avoided death twice that season, she still wanted to do all she could for others, even if it came at the ultimate cost. In the end though, her recklessness was rewarded because karma is a thing, and throughout, she was able to remain her usual fun and yet not annoying peppy self, again not naming any names. While Hibiki thankfully didn't mope around as much as she did previously, she still did have to struggle with her morality, as any good heroine should, especially when dealing with an antagonist with at least some righteous morals of their own. Ultimately, she remained true to her beliefs and methods, but also wasn't above questioning them, especially when they came with consequences, making for a very well-nuanced lead by this point in the series. An overall idealist with a decent amount of practical sense. For someone who seems like your typical hot-blooded lead, she at least has a decent head on her shoulders. Elf 9 became somewhat of the underlying MVP of this season. She acted as the main source of exposition, and of course provided the key to defeating the Faust robes. Yes, it did feel like a little bit of a retread of GX with her creating a MacGuffin to counter the enemy's superior arsenal, but it at least made logical sense here. And again, they had a planned sequel in the works, so this is really just an appetizer for the bulk of her arc that would come to fruition in the following season. Moving on to the antagonist, we had a slightly less mixed bag than usual. I wasn't initially sold on Saint Germain, mostly because I'm not a fan of the Knight Templar archetype. The sort of holier-than-thou type who acts like they're acting towards the greater good. Ignoring the absolute hypocrisy of some of their actions. Thankfully, she didn't completely ignore them, and even seemed to admit that there was more than a bit of her own prejudice mixed into her supposed ideals. And to be fair, some of her views about sacrifice did hold a little water, as there are those who will seek destruction even for the pettiest of reasons. And in the end, she did accept her sins, and while I wouldn't say she made up for how many again? She still at least went out respectably alongside her allies. Speaking of which, Pralati was fine. Of this core trio, she probably got the least development, but was overall a fun character for her cynical attitude and verbal tick. Yet in spite of that, she maintained an undying loyalty to Saint Germain and had at least some respect for Cagliostro. She was held back by being the designated jobber of her team, taking the most L's, as at least Cagliostro planned her so-called defeat. Not a bad character by any means, and I'm sure a certain director got a kick out of her D-wheel, but just not given a whole lot to work with. Cagliostro, I'll say right now, was not only my favorite new character of this season, but probably also one of my overall of this whole franchise. She's just a ton of fun, with her trying to find the bright spot in every moment, except when she's being punched in the gut. She was also easily the most developed among the antagonists. She caught on to Adam's schemes and came up with a good plan to counteract them, showing there's a little more to her than her bubbly personality suggests. Part of that likely came from her being a former con artist, though she did admit she wanted to move away from that past. Makes sense since she was a post-op trans woman. Again, I really appreciate that they didn't make a huge deal out of it and just worked it in naturally into the narrative. The main focus and selling point of her was just being a developed and enjoyable character. And as much as I joke about him, I think Shota Aoi did a fantastic job voicing this character, being able to go from a believable female voice straight into Tetsuya Kakihara territory. Kind of appropriate since they would later work together in My Next Life as a Villainess, where he played Geraldo, and also sung the ending theme.
君は本当にいくつになっても無防備ですね。
Yeah, wrap your brain around that. Tiki was a very one-dimensional character, just a puppet obsessed with her master, but at least she was funny. The fact that she had such a stereotypically cutesy anime voice that would become an actual stereotype later made her kind of an enjoyable jab at the supposed dream dolls of many an otaku fantasy. Speaking of which, yeah, let's talk about this guy. Adam just sucks, and boy do I hate saying that, but there's no way of getting around it. This guy is a bitch. His motivations were based off of a massive superiority complex that he couldn't even really back up, considering that compared to some of the other season final bosses, he really wasn't that hard to beat. And at least Saint Germain, Carol, and Fine had personal vendettas that somewhat elevated them. Hell, even Dr. Ver had clearer goals than this guy. Yes, the mad scientist had better motivations than this loser. In short, he was pretty much like every Shinichiro Miki villain, just some loser who could easily be taken out by some much more interesting antagonists. Him aside, the character work this season was great, as it was supported by one of the more solid plots ever. Again, it's kind of amazing that this season wasn't part of Kaneko's original plans, and yet they were able to tie so many previous elements together so well. Stuff like the alkaloids were implemented logically, forgotten moments like the Fool Stone were revisited as though they were always meant to be brought back, and in general, there was just so much deepening of the show's lore that never really felt like a cheap retcon or anything. Yes, there were some eye-rolling moments like the big revelation that Hibiki could kill a god that came at a moment that made no real difference. But then I see Nodoka punch out the Ultra Mother and my complaints kind of dissipate. On that note, the action of this season was arguably some of the best in the franchise. This was pure Katsumi Odo unfiltered. He no longer had to worry about following Yu-Gi-Oh's broken metagame at the time, and pretty much went all in with his over-the-top action. Everything glorious about this series and its total disregard for physics and practicality were on display. Yes, occasionally Ono would remind us that he just can't give up on card games on motorcycles, but even then we could at least laugh at how blatant it was at times. Again, my belief is that if the creators are having fun, we should at least try to have as much fun with them, which between all of the Gren Lagann, Gao Geiger, and Ultra Series references, I'm having a blast. Oh no, while AXZ was clearly meant to be the bridge to what's currently the final season of the franchise, I personally would like to see a few adaptations of the XD arcs. I really think this season deserves a little more attention. Sure, it has its problems, mostly a disappointing final boss and more than a few eye-rolling moments, but it was also the season where things really started to come together. Previous character arcs were reinforced with some strong moments for everyone, previously minor plot threads were expanded upon in very interesting ways, and of course, like every season, there was just a lot of fun and amazing action scenes with at least 3 antagonists who are more interesting than their boss. This was easily one of my favorite seasons of this franchise, though how it compares with XV, well, we'll have to save that for next time, whenever that is.
I mentioned previously that the next thing I want to do is an analysis video for what I think makes for a good Precure Pink lead. Well, that's kind of ballooned into something more.
As I did my research, I realized that in order to really highlight some of the best elements of Precure, I should take a deeper look at their creators and how Toei's other 2 big franchises have influenced them, especially when taking a look at 2 of their shows this year.
As such, next time we're going to take a look at the main connections between Precure, Super Sentai, and Kamen Rider in a little series I'm calling the Toy Trinity. And until then though, farewell for now my friends, and yeah, this is going to be fun.